A whisper at midnight, calling Miss Marple's name. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you joining from tonight? I can't wait to read your replies. Let's begin. The summer fete in St. Mildred's had always been a mild affair. Even in its liveliest years, it had rarely risen above the level of polite bunting, jam competitions, and the comfortable rustle of wicker picnic baskets under the chestnut trees. On that Saturday afternoon, however, the fete had drawn an unusually large crowd thanks to the addition of a village history exhibition in the church hall, an idea conceived by the energetic vicar's wife, Mrs. Emmeline Parker, who had a fondness for rummaging through old boxes in parish attics. Miss Jane Marple had been persuaded to attend by her friend, Mrs. Weatherby, on the grounds that she might spot someone from the old days in the display of photographs. Though Miss Marple was never one to seek out crowds, she had a weakness for village history. For in her experience, history had a way of shaping character, and character, of course, shaped everything else. The exhibition occupied the length of the polished oak tables in the hall, the air faintly scented with beeswax polish and the fading perfume of dahlias from the flower competition. Each table was lined with photographs, wedding parties in stiff collars and lace, cricket teams with stern expressions, and views of the high street before the war. People leaned over them with murmurs of recognition and the occasional burst of laughter. It was as she was peering at a photograph of the 1923 church choir, several of the boys now bald-headed grandfathers, that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a cluster of people gathered at the far end of the display. There was a ripple of voices, a pause, and then the sound of someone saying, in a tone both incredulous and hushed, "But he's dead. We all went to his funeral." Miss Marple, with her customary air of unobtrusiveness, drifted closer. The group had formed around a sepia-toned photograph, recently enlarged and mounted for the exhibition. It showed the fete of 20 years ago. Bunting strung between the trees, the old cricket pavilion in the background, and a row of villagers standing with teacups in hand. There, third from the left, was a man in a pale suit, smiling faintly at the camera, Mr. Gilbert Ralston. Miss Marple remembered him, a reserved man, not much given to conversation, who had lived in the big house on the edge of the village. He had, according to common knowledge, died abroad 15 years earlier in a motoring accident. The vicar himself had read the telegram in church, and the funeral, though without a body, had been a sombre affair. Yet here he was, in a photograph said to have been taken only last year. Mrs. Parker, flustered, tried to explain that the photograph had been found in a box of miscellaneous images from the photographer's shop in the neighbouring town. It had been labelled simply Saint, Mildred's Fate, without a date. She had assumed it was recent. After all, the bunting was of the new red and gold design, only bought for last summer's event. "But look at the coat," insisted Mrs. Harbottle, leaning in for a better view. "No one's worn a cut like that since the 60s. And the hat. It's Gilbert Ralston's hat, I'd swear to it." Others nodded, whispering in tones that carried the rich undercurrent of village gossip. Miss Marple, without seeming to, studied the faces in the photograph. The man, Ralston, or someone remarkably like him, was not looking directly at the camera, but at a woman in a floral dress beside him. The expression was subtle, almost conspiratorial, and the woman's gloved hand, resting lightly on his sleeve, suggested familiarity. No one seemed to be looking at the background, but Miss Marple noticed a small incongruous detail. The cricket pavilion's notice board, which had been replaced years ago, bore a poster for a charity whist drive dated only 18 months past. The man in the photograph could not have been a ghost from decades ago. By the time Mrs. Parker decided the photograph ought to be taken down to avoid upsetting anyone unnecessarily, the murmur of speculation had already spread through the hall like ripples in a pond. Miss Marple, sitting quietly later with a cup of tepid tea and a slice of seed cake, found her thoughts returning to Gilbert Ralston. If he was alive, then whose funeral had they attended? And why had he been content to be thought dead all these years? In her experience, there was only one reason for disappearing so completely, and it was rarely a pleasant one. The rest of the fete passed in a sort of polite disarray, as though someone had removed one leg of each table and the whole afternoon had to be balanced with careful hands. People queued for the tombola and went through the motions of guessing the weight of the fruitcake, but every conversation, after 2 sentences about weather and dahlias, returned, with a little guilty turn of the head, to the photograph. Mrs. Parker carried it away under her arm as if it were an errant child that had misbehaved in front of the parish, and the vicar, with an air of having been overtaken by modernity, murmured that the police might be best consulted in due course. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, did not follow the photograph. She watched instead the way people resumed their places. Mrs. Harbottle stationed herself by the jam stall with a face bright with indignation. Colonel Faraday, who was long retired from anything more recent than the Boer War, according to his own accounts, had a certain flush to his cheekbone that meant, in a man of his habits, not alcohol, but self-importance, he had something to tell, and was seeking just the right audience. Mrs. Weatherby, placid and well-meaning, collected plates with the briskness of a woman who dislikes loose ends, and the young doctor's wife, Clara Thorne now, but née Lacey, stood a little apart under the chestnut, her hands clasped with that intensity of a person who is telling herself to look natural. "You'll have heard," Colonel Faraday breathed in Miss Marple's direction, having cornered her not 5 minutes later behind the bookstall, "that it's all a mistake with the date. Those village photographers never could be relied upon. Could be a dozen years old, that picture, if indeed it's Ralston at all. Most fellows look alike when they're standing about with a cup." "Many do, Colonel," said Miss Marple, looking up at him with that mild expression that worked on men like the Colonel, rather as a corkscrew works on a bottle. He felt himself open of his own accord. "But the women seldom do, I always think." He blinked. "Women?" "The lady beside him," said Miss Marple, "the one with the floral dress and gloves. One knows a dress if one's mended it, and one knows who does their mending, but it is only a little thought." The Colonel, who never mended anything if he could possibly throw it away, looked baffled, and Miss Marple let the matter rest. By Monday the village had done what villages do best. It had digested the shock and made it into nourishment. At the grocer's, Mrs. Harbottle pronounced that the Ralstons always were peculiar, which was considered evidence by those who had never met them. At the hairdresser, a young mother whispered that she had once seen a figure by the lime walk at Edgehouse on a foggy evening last winter. A man with his collar turned up, which was as good as a photograph if you were cutting someone's fringe and needed the head to stay still. The postmistress, who truly knew everything and said very little, weighed parcels and allowed 2 facts to slip out like letters through a slot. There had been a memorial service without a coffin 15 years ago, and after it, the solicitors had corresponded for months with a foreign consulate and with Mr. Ralston's sister, now dead. No body had ever come home. No certainties had either. Miss Marple listened to all of it as she bought a half-pound of tea and a fresh cake of sunlight soap. She was fond of facts, as housewives are fond of string. She wrapped them carefully, tied them, and put them in a drawer to be found when needed. A village's talk, if one could bear the repetition, was a very good way of learning who had been offended, and when, and by whom. The offended seldom forgot. Mr. Gilbert Ralston had been a reserved man, yes, and rather proud. He had dismissed, more or less overnight, his housekeeper, Mrs. Cutter, 3 months before his death abroad. Mrs. Cutter had found a position with a family in Much Whitlow and came back twice a year to see her married daughter, and spoke of Edgehouse with a sour tightness of mouth. There had been some awkwardness about a bequest. Some thought he had promised something to the church roof fund, which had not materialized in the will. And after the memorial, the estate, so much of it as wasn't swallowed in foreign difficulties, had gone to his sister's girl Clara, who had married Dr. Thorne with quiet speed and less fuss than some had expected. All this was presented to Miss Marple by the village, with the enthusiasm of children emptying their pockets. She thanked them and put the marbles and bent nails neatly away. It was after luncheon that she went, quite as if it were a natural and not at all pointed errand, to the church hall to return a stack of gently worn romance novels to the Fates' second-hand stall. The hall was empty, save for the smell of beeswax and a folding table leaning against the wall. The photograph was not on display. Mrs. Parker, appearing from the vestry with an armful of hymnals, started when she saw Miss Marple and then composed herself. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind. We're sending the leftovers to the jumble for next month," she said, and then, betraying in a glance what she had meant to hold back, added, "The picture is put away for the moment. The vicar thought it best." "Quite right," said Miss Marple soothingly. "When people are upset, one ought not to put temptation in their way. May I have just a little look? It often happens that things are less worrying the second time one sees them." Mrs. Parker hesitated, then yielded, for there was something about Miss Marple that invited confidences as naturally as summer invites flies. She produced the photograph from a drawer in the vestry desk and laid it on the blotter. The pale man with the grave smile, the gloved hand on his sleeve, the bunting like rows of washing in a respectable garden. There they all were. Miss Marple did not touch it at once. She bent, and then she did touch, but only the edge, because it is always useful to see what people think is the important part. "The poster," Miss Marple said gently. "Ah, yes, the whist drive for sailors. Mrs. Weatherby organised that last spring. She prefers a blue pen to black. It gives a cheerful air to invitations. And Mrs. Parker, forgive me, if anyone is capable of recognising a hem you are. That banner, was it not mended last July when it tore on the corner of the fence? You used the red thread from the altar frontal because you were out of ordinary cotton." Mrs. Parker, who did not consider sewing a small matter, breathed out, Yes, that's perfectly right. The tear is there. Look, under the third flag." She peered more closely. "Oh, my dear." "I only wondered," said Miss Marple, "because people are so very eager to make it old. Sometimes they do that when the present is uncomfortable." Mrs. Parker glanced at her, a trace of alarm on her kind face. "Do you think we ought to tell Clara? Dr. Thorne said this morning that it's a silly fuss." "Doctors," said Miss Marple, "are taught to soothe. It is very useful, but I think Clara has already told herself whatever will be hardest." She took her leave then, but not before noticing, as she stood, something small and homely, a faint smear along the card backing, just where a person would pinch it to lift it. It looked like the creamy mark left by furniture polish when enthusiastic hands are not entirely dry. Such marks have a way of indicating who is careful and who is hasty. They are not decisive, only human. Edge House lay beyond the lime walk, with that air which large houses acquire when they have had more lawyers than laughter in recent years. The lawn was admirable and subtly tired. The borders were neat rather than loved. Miss Marple did not go up the drive, for she had no errand that would not have seemed artificial, and she disliked artificial errands. But it happened, naturally as these things will, that the gardener, Mr. Pike, bicycled past her where the lane met the fields, and stopped of his own accord to remark on the heat and on the vicar's roses, which had black spot again, and then, sobered by his own recollection, to mention that there had been, twice this week, a light in the library at Edge House late past midnight. "There's a draught that clicks the door," Mr. Pike said, "and I hears it when I locks the garden gate from inside. Doctor says it's the way the old place breathes, but last night I saw a shape cross the window, and that bain't a breath." "Perhaps someone reading late," suggested Miss Marple, as if lights were always accounted for. "Perhaps," said Mr. Pike, and looked unconvinced in the way of a man who knows every rabbit in every hedge between the bridge and the church, and does not confuse them with something bigger. Clara Thorne came down the steps as Mr. Pike wheeled on and saw Miss Marple by the lane and came forward, carefully, like a person walking across a rug that might have holes in it. She had been a delicate child and had perfected the art of seeming braver than she felt. The habit had not left her. "Miss Marple," she said, "is it true? I mean, does it look like him?" Her face was pale but steady. "It looks like him," said Miss Marple, and the honesty was a kindness. "But photographs, my dear, are like reflections in water. If you have ever seen a trout, you will know that the ripple can make it look 3 times its size or none at all. What matters is not the picture, but the thing itself." Clara's gaze drifted past Miss Marple to the lane, as if the thing itself might appear out of it, hat at the old angle, hand in the old way. "If he were alive," she said very quietly, "then everything that was mine would not be mine. That's an ugly thought, and I am ashamed of it." "There is no shame in knowing what one stands to lose," said Miss Marple. "Only in letting that knowledge make one unkind." Clara's mouth moved in something like a smile. "Peter says it's nonsense. He says people see what they want." "Doctors," said Miss Marple again, not unkindly, and Clara looked almost relieved to be teased by the truth. At the corner of the High Street, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Inez Carroway from Miller's Cottage, a handsome, dark-haired woman with a foreign gravity to her carriage and a headscarf tied just so. Mrs. Carroway was a relative newcomer. Her late husband had been an engineer, and she taught piano to the children of the village very successfully, according to mothers who had not succeeded with their own scales. She was carrying a small parcel from the draper's, neatly wrapped, and greeted Miss Marple with that warmth which people use when they are studying you, while they appear to be embracing you. "You will have heard," she said, lowering her voice to a confidential melody, "about the picture. I do not think it is possible. But then in my country the dead sometimes do not stay dead on paper." Miss Marple smiled. "Paper is capable of many resurrections. Is that new ribbon for a pupil's hair?" Mrs. Carroway's eyes flickered for the briefest moment. "For a dress," she said, and slipped the parcel a little further into her bag. It had the elasticity of crepe, Miss Marple noticed. Black crepe, like the sort one uses to trim a hat in mourning, though the fashion had gone out. One could, of course, use it for other things. One usually did not. In the evening the vicar telephoned, apologetic and fluttered. "Miss Marple, terribly sorry to disturb you at this hour, but Mrs. Parker has, mislaid the photograph. That is, not mislaid. She put it in the vestry drawer after you had gone, I believe, and when she went to fetch it for me just now, we cannot find it. The drawer is not locked, of course, but the hall has been shut since tea. I wonder, do you think we ought—" "To trouble the police?" Miss Marple supplied gently. "Yes, perhaps. People sometimes remove what they think will hurt others, but they often remove what will later hurt themselves. It will be as well to have it on record that the thing was there and is now not there." She hung up and sat for a little while with her knitting in her lap. The evening air from the cottage garden crept in with the smell of sweet peas and the distant homely sound of someone winding a clock. She was thinking of the gloved hand on the sleeve in the photograph, and of how hands behave when they feel watched. She was thinking, too, of the little smear of polish on the card, so ordinary, so domestic. Women's fingers, she reflected, tell the truth about them more often than their faces do. The careful ones take the time to wipe away what they have left. Those in a hurry do not. It was not proof of anything. Proof, she had found, was a rare flower, and one left it to the gardeners. But habit was a hedgerow. Everything nested there. When Inspector Hewitt came down from the county town next morning, tidy, well-spoken, with a habit of fixing on the harmless explanation as a man fixes on a safe step along a riverbank, he listened to the vicar and to Mrs. Parker and turned the empty drawer over with a forensic attention that pleased the vicar and did not impress Miss Marple. He suggested, with an air of offering a cushion to an uncomfortable chair, that the date of the photograph was wrong and that the figure might be a cousin or merely an unfortunate resemblance. Miss Marple, who did not interrupt policemen, mentioned, when asked, the whist drive poster and the repaired bunting. Inspector Hewitt conceded that these were bothersome details and proposed that perhaps the photograph had been damaged, and Mrs. Parker, in a fit of conscientiousness, had removed it somewhere safe and forgotten quite where. Mrs. Parker flushed and denied it. "Memory," said the inspector, "is a tricky thing." "Very," Miss Marple agreed, "which is why it is so interesting when people remember to forget the same thing." He looked at her and then looked away, and Miss Marple's heart warmed to him despite herself. It is difficult work to be sensible in a world that prefers calm. By lunchtime, a parish leaflet was discovered that showed, in miniature and blurred monochrome, the same line of fete-goers with the bunting overhead. It was last summer's appeal for the roof fund, and the village printer had done no favours to anyone's face. But there, small as a postage stamp, was the man in the pale suit, turned just so, and the woman's gloved hand on his sleeve. The leaflet did what photographs often do when you need them to save you and they decline. It confirmed without clarifying. The inspector took it away in a plastic envelope. The vicar locked the vestry drawer as if to show it who was master. That afternoon, as Miss Marple walked home by the field path, she saw the thin, dark line of the lime trees bending the light, and thought how, at certain angles, a living man can be mistaken for his own memory. She had no certainty that Mr. Ralston lived. Certainty is a privilege one rarely has in the beginning. But she had, already, the shape of several people's fears. They lay about the village like the shadows thrown by the bunting, narrow and repetitive, and telling you, if you only stood still long enough, where the rope was tied. It would be a pity, she thought, if the photograph had gone for good. People erased what frightened them, and then discovered, too late, that the erasure made a neater space for something worse. In the meantime, there was the inquiry to go on with, not of chemicals and enlargers and dates stamped in margins, but of gloves and hems, and who put their hand where, and why. Human nature had written on that card more clearly than the printer ever could. And human nature, she had found, does not smudge unless pressed. On the following morning, the village awoke to a damp, sullen mist that seemed to have rolled in from the river and settled deliberately over St. Mildred's, softening outlines and muting colours. The air smelled faintly of turned earth and rain on stone, and footsteps on the high street sounded closer than they ought to. Miss Marple, looking out from her window as she laid her knitting aside, thought how such weather always made people a little slower to greet one another, as though the mist itself were listening. It was the sort of day when news travelled, not with shouts, but with leanings in, a hand on the arm, a murmur. And indeed, the first knock on her door was not Mrs. Weatherby with her usual brisk cheer, but young Lydia Pike, the gardener's niece, cheeks flushed from walking uphill. Lydia had a way of making her messages seem both casual and urgent, which in a village is a valuable talent. "Mum said I was to tell you," Lydia began, pushing her damp hair from her face, "that she saw Dr. Thorne's motor car out by the edge of the Ralston wood last night, near to midnight. She couldn't sleep on account of the wind rattling the scullery door, so she was looking out. Lights were on, she said, just past the bend, and then they went off sudden." Miss Marple nodded, thanked her, and sent her off with a biscuit in her pocket. She did not doubt the sighting. Lydia's mother, Mrs. Pike, was not a woman to mistake a motor car's lights, and if she said it was Dr. Thorne's, it was. Still, lights and motor cars were not crimes in themselves, and Miss Marple had lived long enough to know the trouble that comes from assuming they are. But she also knew that people seldom drive to the edge of a wood at midnight, for reasons they would be comfortable recounting in the morning. By 10 o'clock, she had taken her umbrella and made her way into the high street. The mist had begun to lift in patches, revealing sudden glimpses of bright geraniums in cottage windows and the sharp black lines of slate roofs. At the grocer's, she bought a quarter-pound of cheese and lingered to listen. Mrs. Harbottle was in fine form, recounting to a rapt audience how she had never trusted that man Ralston, and was now entirely sure that he had been mixed up in foreign dealings of a nature too serious to name. Someone asked whether, if he were alive, He might have come back to fetch something from Edgehouse. And Mrs. Harbottle replied that she wouldn't be surprised if the thing fetched was a person. This earned her a scolding from the grocer, who preferred his customers to speak of sugar and tea, not abductions. But the point had been made. Miss Marple smiled faintly, paid for her cheese, and went on to the post office, where the postmistress was engaged in sorting a tray of letters. She lowered her voice when she saw Miss Marple and said, "Had a letter posted last night after closing hours. Left in the outside box. Foreign stamp. No return address." She tapped her temple. Handwriting. Careful, not native. Went to London sorting first, of course, but I'd wager it was from one of our own sending abroad, not the other way. And I'd swear it was written in a hurry. You can see it in the slope. It was not much, but Miss Marple took it in with the interest of a collector adding a new piece to a set. Letters posted in haste at odd hours often meant that their writer did not want to be seen sending them, and that was a species of behaviour worth noting. She continued her morning's walk toward Edgehouse, though she did not intend to go in. The air was cooler here under the lime trees, and the sound of her own footsteps was swallowed by the thick grass at the verge. The house itself appeared much as it had before, tall, reserved, its windows reflecting the pale light. But there was something different in the air about it, as though the silence was not quite unbroken. Through a gap in the hedge, she saw a figure move past the library window, a woman this time, in a dark dress, her head turning sharply as though listening. The curtains shifted a moment later, and the space behind them became still. Miss Marple walked on without pausing, but she carried the image with her. A house with someone moving inside when it was supposed to be empty. Empty except for the thorns, was a house with something to hide. By afternoon, she had a visitor of her own. Inspector Hewitt appeared at her gate, his hat in his hands, and his manner suggesting that he was both puzzled and faintly amused. "Miss Marple," he began, as she ushered him into the little sitting room, "we've had a telephone call from the station in Much Whitlow. A Mr. Harry Cutler turned up there this morning claiming he could prove that Ralston is alive. Says he's seen him, here in St. Mildred's, within the last week. Thought we ought to know." Harry Cutler was, as Miss Marple recalled, a man of middling honesty and great enthusiasm for dramatic statements. "Did he say where?" she asked mildly. "At the Greyhound," Hewitt replied. "Late on Thursday night. Claims Ralston was sitting in the corner, talking low with a lady in a headscarf. Says he knew him straight off." Hewitt's expression shifted, as if he were weighing how much to believe. "Now, it's possible, but Cutler's been known to mistake one man for another, especially after 2 pints. Miss Marple nodded. "And the lady in the headscarf?" Hewitt smiled faintly. "Says he didn't see her face properly, only that she had a foreign look about her." Miss Marple let the words settle between them. She thought of Mrs. Inez Carroway with her dark hair and her precise, graceful manner, and of the black crepe ribbon in her parcel. It was not proof, certainly, but it was a thread, and threads, in her experience, were worth following quietly. They spoke a little longer, Hewitt departing with his polite scepticism intact, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting. She was halfway through a row when the click of her garden gate drew her eyes to the window. Clara Thorne stood there, hesitant, looking as though she had rehearsed what she meant to say and then forgotten it entirely. "May I come in?" she asked when Miss Marple opened the door. She sat, smoothing her skirt, and for a moment only looked at the small vase of sweet peas on the table. "I had a visitor this morning," she said at last. "A woman. Said she'd once worked for my uncle. Asked odd questions. Wanted to know whether I still had any of his papers. I told her no, they were all destroyed years ago. But she didn't seem to believe me." Miss Marple asked, "Did she give her name?" "She said Cutter," Clara replied slowly. "Mrs. Cutter. But she looked different from how I remember. Older, of course, but also harder. She hinted that my uncle had enemies, that some of them might still be close by." The name settled into place at once for Miss Marple, the housekeeper dismissed so abruptly before Ralston's supposed death. A woman who had been sent away without kindness will often keep her resentment warm for years, feeding it carefully until the day comes to serve it back. They spoke a little more, Clara revealing that the encounter had left her unsettled enough to lock the desk in the library, though she had nothing in it of value. Miss Marple listened without pressing her, for she could see that Clara was holding something back, not a lie exactly, but a reluctance to step nearer to the truth. When Clara had gone, the evening drew in with a softness that made the lamps seem brighter than they were. Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour and let the events arrange themselves in her mind. The vanished photograph, the light in the library, the midnight motor car, the headscarf in the greyhound, the housekeeper's questions. They did not yet form a complete picture, but there were edges, and some of the pieces seemed to have the same grain. One thing was certain to her: Gilbert Ralston, whether alive or not, had become the pivot around which several people's fears and intentions were turning. And in her long experience, such a pivot never remained still for long. Something, whether a word, a meeting, or another disappearance, would soon give it a push. When it came, she meant to be standing quite nearby, with her eyes open and her knitting in her lap, looking for all the world as if she had not noticed a thing. It was not, in the event, the police who moved the matter forward, but the small machinery of village life, which turns as steadily as any clock if one has the patience to watch the hands. Miss Marple, who had never in her life cursed patience, went first where people go to say what they intend not to have said: the greyhound. She arrived as the door was propped open for the morning air and asked for a pot of tea and a plate of plain biscuits, which the landlord, Mr. Trellis, provided with the deferential confusion of a man who feels his premises too rough for such gentility. She took a table by the window, not the corner bench where Harry Cutler had pointed with his thumb the night before as he embroidered his recollection there, and let the pub's scents of beer, wood polish, and yesterday's tobacco settle about her. Mr. Trellis, having wiped a glass that needed no wiping, hovered. "You'll have heard what's being said, Miss Marple. I don't hold with upsetting ladies, but if you're asking me, Mr. Cutler sees two of most things after 9. Still," his voice dropped, because men like Trellis always have room for a story they doubt, "there was a pair in that corner on Thursday, late on. Quiet as church mice they were. The lady had a scarf over her hair and kept her head down. Didn't want to be noticed, if you take me." Miss Marple did not look toward the corner, because she had no need. "What did she drink?" she asked, pouring her tea. It was a question that sometimes separated lies from truths, for people remember their own orders more readily than other people's faces. "Coffee," he said at once. "Black. Asked if I had lemon, which I said I hadn't. The gentleman had a whiskey and then another." They didn't stay long. He went first, and she left by the side door, the lane past the stables. Most don't use it unless they mean not to be seen. "Thank you," said Miss Marple, and ate a biscuit as if that were all. Before she left, she asked, lightly, whether the lady had touched her cup with gloves. Mr. Trellis thought not. He remembered pale hands and a ring that clicked lightly against the china. "A narrow sort of ring, like a little belt, with a buckle on it," he said, frowning. "Old-fashioned in a way." Rings, Miss Marple reflected, as she walked back into the brightening day, were like sentences. They told on their wearers when nothing else did. She had seen that ring once, on a hand poised above Middle Sea. Mrs. Inez Carraway wore it when she beat time for small pupils reluctant to march. It may, of course, have been another ring like it. Villages, like families, sometimes repeat themselves. From the greyhound it was no trouble at all, if one were a lady of Miss Marple's years, to have reason to call at Miller's cottage. A small boy with a fretful upper lip, and a mother more fretful still, had been sent to practice scales with Mrs. Carraway at 11. Miss Marple happened to arrive at 10 minutes past, with a parcel that required advice about mending elastic, the sort of parcel that explains its own presence and cannot be hurried. Music bled thinly through the door, the sort of practicing that sounds like someone tapping with a spoon on a staircase. Mrs. Carraway herself opened, dark hair neatly pinned, a scarf around it in a way that might have been for tidiness and might, equally, have been habit. "Miss Marple," she said, with that courteous gravity which made mothers feel their children were safe and children feel they were being watched. "How kind!" The cottage was very clean and very exact. A dishcloth was folded like paper. The piano's keys gleamed. On the sideboard stood a bottle of furniture polish, the very make whose scent had lingered on the card backing of the photograph. That was not remarkable. Most people used what the grocer sold. Near it lay a hat with a narrow brim. Upon it, neatly sewn, a band of black crepe, such as one might add for mourning in places where such customs are kept. Miss Marple's eyes passed over it, as over anything else you might have on a sideboard. One does not stare at grief. One allows it to exist. "Your pupils are diligent," Miss Marple said, because the little boy had, heroically, reached the top of his scale and was creeping down again. "They are diligent when their mothers are," Mrs. Carroway returned, and there was the smallest dry note under the words. She offered tea, which Miss Marple declined, and they spoke for a few minutes of ribbon and of stitches. Miss Marple admired, in a friendly way, the cotton dress laid over a chair back to air, a floral print with a particular arrangement of forget-me-nots and small leaves. "It reminds me," she said as if to herself, "of the dress in the photograph at the fete, the one beside Mr. Ralston. I thought then it was a pretty pattern. Funny how patterns come round again." Mrs. Carroway's hand, which had been smooth in its motion over the fabric, paused only a fraction before continuing. "These village prints do repeat," she said. "I buy from whatever bolt the draper has." Her voice held the evenness of a person who has practiced evenness. "We should not keep the child waiting," Miss Marple apologized, and made her compliments to the boy, who accepted them solemnly, and went out into the lane. At the corner she met Mrs. Pike, who had a way of appearing where plants needed pinching out and news needed pinching in. "Did you see?" Mrs. Pike began without preamble. "She's put black on her hat again. I thought she'd done with it last year." "Grief," said Miss Marple mildly, "is not arithmetic." Mrs. Pike snorted. "No, but it's social. And I say it's for show. She had it off all spring. Now it's on. People do that when they're about to be asked questions they'd rather not answer." It was not an observation to be dismissed. Miss Marple considered how quickly the crepe had been sewn, how neat the stitches. Very neat, very recent. She thanked Mrs. Pike and went on, taking, when she reached the high street, the small step of turning into the post office. The postmistress, who had the respect for privacy of one who knows more than everyone and says less than most, did not need to be prompted. "That letter last night, the hurried one," she murmured, sliding a coil of string from one hand to the other. "Foreign stamp, as I said, addressed to Lisbon. There, I may as well say it, since you'll have guessed. The hand tried to make itself English and didn't quite manage. I did not recognize it. Not one of my usual foreign writers. Not the vicar's, not the doctor's. A woman's hand, if you ask me. The way the T's were crossed. We see so much of people's hands, we forget their faces." Miss Marple agreed, gravely. "Lisbon. Mr. Ralston's difficulties had, according to old whispers, once run through that city like a thread. His late sister had had to pester a consulate there for news 15 years ago. The past repeats too, not only fabric. At home she found Clara waiting, pale and determined in the way of someone who has decided to be brave before she is frightened. "Peter says it's nonsense," she began instantly, as if the sentence had been rehearsed in the walk across 2 streets. "He says I should keep busy, but I cannot keep busy with a thing like this wandering about." Mrs. Cutter came again. Miss Marple drew her to the sofa and listened. Mrs. Cutter had returned to Edgehouse at noon, having, as she put it, remembered something left undone. She had asked to see the library, for old time's sake, and had stood there with her hands folded as if measuring the room. Then she had said, in that tight-lipped way of people who carry a grievance like a parcel, that certain people had paid dear to keep Mr. Ralston gone, and would be reluctant to have their money wasted by a photograph. She implied, Clara said, her voice low, that I had a duty to keep quiet. She said it would be better for me. Miss Marple, I think she wanted me to be afraid. People who have been dismissed without ceremony sometimes make a ceremony of fear, Miss Marple said. It gives them back a sense of order. Clara twisted her handkerchief. There's something else. Peter found a note today in the blotter on the library desk, only a few words, in pencil. Wednesday, Lane by the Copse, after dark, no name. He says it could be anything, it could be old, but the pencil was fresh. Wednesday, said Miss Marple. And this is Tuesday. People who make appointments in lanes generally do not mean to be seen keeping them. She did not tell Clara what Mrs. Pike had said about the doctor's motor car at midnight, or ask Clara why the library lamp burned late. Instead, she inquired, as if it had strayed into her mind, whether the floral dress Clara wore last summer, the one with blue flowers, was still in her wardrobe. Clara looked at her blankly and then coloured. I gave it to the jumble for the missionaries, she said. After the fête, I didn't feel like wearing it again. Miss Marple nodded, as if that settled nothing and everything. Some women keep dresses as a sort of diary. Others tear the page out when the entry displeases them. In the late afternoon, she took her knitting to the little green by the church and let the village pass before her as if it were a pageant. She saw Dr. Thorne bicycling down from Edge House, with his shoulders set in the shape of a man who is resolved to be reasonable in all things. She saw Mrs. Carraway walking with a parcel long and narrow as a music folio, the black band newly sewn on her hat shadowing her face in a way that would spare her from recognition if she wished it. She saw, also, Mr. Harry Cutler, loafing near the Greyhound in case his story might require retelling with additions, and she saw the vicar crossing to the hall with keys, still locking drawers that no longer held what they should. At dusk the mist returned, thinner now, and the lime trees made their little shivering sounds. Miss Marple, having lit her lamp and prepared her simple supper, was fastening the cottage latch when something slipped under the door with the soft, decisive sound of a paper that knows where it is going. She opened the door at once and saw nothing but the hedge and the deeper dark beyond. Whoever had come had gone. On the mat lay a small envelope, unaddressed. She carried it to the table, took out the single enclosure, and laid it flat. It was a photograph, but not the fate one. This was smaller, more intimate, and more recent by the look of the edges. It showed, in the wavering light of a lane lamp, two figures very near together. A man in a pale suit with his head turned, and a woman with a scarf tied over her hair, her face half tilted toward his. The angle was wrong for certainty. People in films are always easy to recognize, and people in life are not. But the ring, a narrow band with a tiny buckle, caught the flash in a small bright point that made Miss Marple breathe out very softly. In the corner, in a hand that had carefully tried to disguise itself and had failed in the way most disguises fail, by being too careful, were two penciled words. Keep quiet. Miss Marple looked at the words for a long time, not because she was impressed by their menace, but because people's spelling, pressure, and caution tell things about them they would never confess. The Q had a little tail loop made by someone taught by a governess or a foreign school. The pencil had been newly sharpened and pressed too hard, as if the writer thought force might make secrecy more secret. She slid the photograph back into its paper and laid it by. There would be, she thought, an appointment kept tomorrow in the lane by the copse. There would be a woman who believed that mourning could be put on and taken off like a sash, and a man who had, perhaps, never been where he was buried. There would be others too, people who left polish on card and smudges on their consciences, people who remembered to forget, people who drove to woods at night and asked for black coffee with lemon. It was not yet a murder. She did not say that word in her mind, because one mustn't invite what one cannot bear to host. But the village was moving towards something as surely as the river moved toward the weir. And Miss Marple, who knew rivers, intended to be standing on the bank when it went over. The next morning dawned bright and cold, the sort of weather that turns breath into small ghosts and makes the outlines of things too sharp to ignore. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual, her mind already on the lane by the copse. She did not, of course, intend to stand there in plain view like a character in a melodrama. Appointments made in secrecy are like shy birds. Show yourself too plainly, and they take flight. But there are ways of being near without being noticed, especially for a small elderly lady who seems to be looking for something in the hedgerow or pausing to rest her knee. She prepared her morning as she always did, tea, toast, a quiet glance over the Daily Chronicle. But her thoughts lingered on the photograph slipped under her door. The pale suit, the scarf, the ring. It was an odd kind of threat, one that relied not on boldness, but on intimacy. We know you see, and we want you not to speak. She had not decided yet whether it had been meant to frighten her or to make her curious enough to stumble into something worse. By mid-morning, she took her knitting and set off along the footpath that looped toward the fields behind the copse. The lane itself was narrow, pressed on either side by hawthorn hedges, still beaded with the last of the dew. The meeting, if it was to happen, would not be until dusk, but Miss Marple liked to know the lay of a place beforehand. She noted the slight dip near the old oak where voices might carry less, the gap in the hedge that led to a field, and the small rise just before the bend that would allow her to watch the approach without being seen. She also noticed a fresh set of tire marks pressed into the verge. A single car, narrow wheels, turning carefully in a space where one would not turn unless one had reason to stop. On her way back, she met Mr. Pike, trundling along with a spade over his shoulder. He nodded in his slow way and remarked that the doctor had been out early again, passing the lime walk before breakfast. When Miss Marple asked if he'd seen him return, Mr. Pike shook his head. Didn't see the motor car come back neither. Could be he went straight on somewhere else. He looked at her, measuring whether to say more, then added, "There's been someone in the old tool shed at the far end of the Edge House garden. Saw the door standing a crack yesterday. Been shut tight since before the war." Miss Marple thanked him, thinking how sheds are like mines. Most people never open them unless they've something particular to put in or take out. After luncheon, she wrote 2 small notes. One to Inspector Hewitt asking, in her gentle way, whether the police had made any inquiries about Mrs. Cutter's present lodgings, and another to Mrs. Weatherby, suggesting they take a walk that evening for the air. The latter note she delivered herself, knowing Mrs. Weatherby would not refuse and would think the walk entirely her own idea. The day wore on in that slow, deceptive way of village days, where nothing seems to happen until suddenly everything does. By 7:30, the light had thinned to a soft grey, and the lane by the copse took on that curious privacy dusk grants to public places. Miss Marple and Mrs. Weatherby strolled along the upper path that ran parallel to the lane, their talk comfortably meandering over jam recipes and the disappointing state of the vicar's roses. From the slight rise near the oak, Miss Marple could see the bend ahead. It was nearly 20 minutes before the first figure appeared, a woman, walking quickly, her headscarf pulled low. She kept to the hedge, glancing once over her shoulder. Even in the failing light, the line of her walk was recognizable to Miss Marple. Mrs. Carroway, though the scarf was tied differently tonight. A few minutes later came a motor car, its lights briefly cutting across the hedgerows before it stopped just beyond the bend. A man stepped out, tall, in a pale coat that caught what little light was left. He left the door ajar and walked toward her. The meeting was quiet enough that even Mrs. Weatherby's steady chatter couldn't cover the low murmur of voices. Miss Marple caught only fragments. "Can't stay here. Too many questions. Not safe." And then the woman's voice, sharper. "You promised." A pause, the sound of something pressed into a pocket, and the man turning back toward the car. Mrs. Weatherby, intent on a point about preserving quinces, did not notice Miss Marple's slight hesitation as they passed the gap in the hedge. She had seen, in that brief space, the glint of the ring when the woman raised a hand, and the set of the man's shoulders that was too familiar to dismiss. She also noticed the car's registration as it turned and drove away, a detail she would keep to herself for the moment. They returned to the village without hurry, parting at the corner. Miss Marple did not go straight home, but walked instead toward the post office. It was closed, of course, but in the lamplight she could see that the outside letterbox had been emptied not long ago. A faint smudge of dust disturbed around the slot suggested recent use. Someone had posted something quickly, perhaps from the very meeting she had just witnessed. Back at her cottage, she had scarcely set down her knitting before there was another knock. Clara Thorne stood there, pale and visibly agitated. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry. It's just that something's gone from the library." She stepped inside, speaking quickly. "Peter keeps certain old files, medical notes, letters from patients who've moved abroad. Nothing confidential left, he says, but this morning one of the folders was missing. He thought perhaps he'd mislaid it. But tonight, the desk was unlocked and—" She broke off, pressing a hand to her forehead. "The photograph from the fete. It was in there. I didn't put it there, but it was there. This morning. Now it's gone." Miss Marple regarded her with calm sympathy. "And you are certain no one else in the house has been in that desk?" Clara shook her head. "Only Peter and me, and the key's always on his chain." Miss Marple thought of the shed in the Edgehouse garden, the scarf in the lane, the faint scent of polish. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people put things where they think no one will look, only to find those are the very places others expect." Clara stared at her for a moment, as if wanting to ask more, then seemed to think better of it. She left with a murmured good night, her unease trailing after her like the hem of a dress. When Miss Marple was alone again, she took out the photograph from the envelope and laid it on the table beside her knitting. The Lane meeting had confirmed one thing: the pattern of the ring, the tilt of the head, the guarded urgency in the body language. They matched too closely to be dismissed as coincidence. The pale-suited man might not yet be named, but she was increasingly certain of the woman, and certainty about one piece often pulls the rest into place. She sat a long while in the quiet, the clock ticking like a pulse. The village would sleep, thinking perhaps the matter had gone quiet. But Miss Marple knew that quiet in such cases is not peace. It is the moment when all the players are deciding their next move. Someone had gone to the trouble of staging a warning, another of removing evidence, and both acts spoke not of an old scandal revived, but of something very much alive. When she finally rose to bank the fire, she glanced once more at the photograph, at the small, bright point of light where the ring caught the camera's flash. It was a careless giveaway in an otherwise careful game, and in her experience, it was often the smallest, most ordinary betrayals of habit that unravelled the neatest plans. Tomorrow she would have to speak to Inspector Hewitt again, carefully, because policemen prefer facts over impressions, and she had more of the latter than the former. But she suspected that before long, there would be more than impressions. There would be a crime no one could dismiss as a mistake of dates or an unfortunate resemblance. And when that moment came, she meant to have her knitting ready and her eyes exactly where they needed to be. The following day began with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The air was crisp, washed clean by the faintest overnight rain, and the cobblestones of the high street gleamed faintly in the morning sun. Miss Marple, however, was not lulled by the calm. She had lived through enough village dramas to know that quiet days often hide their own industry. People, when unsettled, move carefully, closing drawers, holding conversations in doorways, making the sort of telephone calls that sound casual, but are not. She made her way to the grocer's after breakfast, her basket swinging lightly on her arm. The shop was busy, the way it always was on Thursdays, with Mrs. Harbottle loudly instructing the boy behind the counter on the proper firmness of apples, and Colonel Faraday proclaiming that the local paper ought to print fewer advertisements and more facts. Their talk skimmed over the business of the photograph, but only in the way one might skim over a stone that has sunk deep. The ripples were still there, quiet, but undeniable. Miss Marple bought tea and a small loaf, lingering just long enough to overhear that Mrs. Cutter had been seen in the village again that morning, this time near the Drapers. Mrs. Pike, who claimed to have spotted her, added that she looked pleased with herself in a nasty sort of way, which in Mrs. Pike's scale of observations suggested that the woman had achieved something she intended. Miss Marple thanked the grocer, tucked the information away, and stepped into the high street sunlight. She did not have to wait long before her next encounter. Mrs. Carroway came toward her from the direction of the post office, dressed in a dark wool coat despite the mildness of the day, a narrow handbag clutched close. She greeted Miss Marple warmly enough, but her eyes flicked once toward the post office door, as if to check whether anyone had followed her out. "You are about early," Miss Marple observed pleasantly. "I had an errand to town yesterday," Mrs. Carroway replied, as if answering a question Miss Marple had not asked. "And there were things to post today. One must keep busy." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Indeed. I always find the post office so interesting. There is a sense of the world beyond the village, letters going to far-off places, Lisbon, for instance." She said the name without emphasis, as though it had drifted into her mind without intention. For the briefest moment, the other woman's fingers tightened on her handbag strap. "Yes," she said lightly, "so many places I have never been." And with that, she excused herself, moving off with the quick, contained steps of someone who has been reminded of something unpleasant. By late morning, Miss Marple had settled herself in her small sitting room with her knitting. But her mind was not on the stitches. The Lane meeting, the missing photograph, the Lisbon letter, Mrs. Carroway's evasiveness. It was as if she had all the pieces of a puzzle, yet they stubbornly refused to fit into a clear image. And still, there was the question of Gilbert Ralston himself. If he was alive, where had he been hiding, and why return now? If he was dead, who was taking such care to create the illusion that he was not? The knock at her door came just before luncheon. Inspector Hewitt stood there, looking more serious than usual, his hat in his hands. "Miss Marple, I thought you should hear this before the village invents its own version. There's been an incident at Edge House." She ushered him in, her expression mild, but her interest keen. "An incident?" "A break-in by the looks of it. The library window, unlatched from the inside, so whoever it was had a key. Nothing obviously stolen, according to Dr. Thorne, but the desk drawers had been searched, and—" He paused, his gaze sharpening slightly. "There were muddy footprints in the hall, a man's, size 9 or 10, leading from the window to the library and back out again. The doctor insists nothing of value is missing, but—" "But sometimes value is not the same as importance," Miss Marple finished for him. He gave her a wry smile. "Exactly. And here's the other thing. One of the gardeners swears he saw Mrs. Cutter leaving the garden gate yesterday evening, just before the rain started. She claimed she'd come to see Mrs. Thorne, but Mrs. Thorne says she hasn't spoken to her since the day they met by chance in the high street." Miss Marple considered this quietly. It is always interesting when someone enters a house for one reason and leaves without it being fulfilled. "May I ask, did anyone notice whether the shed at the far end of the garden was disturbed?" The inspector's eyebrows lifted. "Funny you should mention that. The gardener found it unlocked this morning. Nothing in it but dust and a few old crates. But one crate had been moved, pushed under the window as if someone had stood on it to look out." Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap. "A shed makes an excellent waiting place for those who wish to observe without being observed. And people do not stand on crates for the view unless they expect to see something worth the trouble." He left soon after, promising to keep her informed, though she knew well enough that official channels moved at their own pace. That afternoon, Miss Marple took the path toward Edge House herself, walking with the unhurried air of a woman out for nothing more than a stretch of the legs The lime trees rustled faintly overhead, their leaves beginning to turn. At the bend near the gate, she paused, ostensibly to adjust her scarf, and saw Clara Thorne on the steps, speaking in low tones to her husband. Clara's face was pale, and her hands were clasped tightly together. The doctor, noticing Miss Marple, lifted a hand in greeting, but Clara's eyes slid away, fixed on some point in the middle distance. Miss Marple continued on, her mind sifting through the morning's details. There was a shape emerging now, not yet the full picture, but a pattern of movements and intentions. Mrs. Cutter's unexplained visits, Mrs. Carraway's guardedness, Clara's unspoken fear, and threading through it all, the shadow of Gilbert Ralston, a man whose presence was as disruptive in death or in life as it had ever been in his time among them. The evening brought fresh unease. As she sat with her supper, Miss Marple heard the faint crunch of gravel outside her cottage. She rose quietly, moving to the window in time to see a figure pass under the lamplight. A man, his collar turned up, walking quickly in the direction of the church hall. There was something familiar in the set of his shoulders, though the light caught only a fraction of his profile before he disappeared into the shadows. She considered following, but caution and long practice kept her in place. If someone was moving about the village at night with their face half hidden, there would be a reason, and that reason would bring them into clearer view soon enough. In her experience, people carrying secrets cannot help but carry them into the open eventually. The burden grows too heavy, and some careless gesture loosens their grip. For now, she would wait, as she always had, watching the pieces edge closer together, knowing that the moment was coming when they would lock into place. And the true picture, once seen, could never be unseen again. The morning after her glimpse of the man in the lamplight, Miss Marple was up earlier than usual, her mind circling that single image, the turned-up collar, the swift, purposeful stride, the shadowed face that revealed just enough to tease recognition without offering certainty. She knew better than to trust such fleeting impressions entirely, but she also knew that when a figure reappears in one's thoughts unbidden, there is usually a reason. The village itself appeared to be going about its ordinary business. The milk cart rattled down the high street, children dawdled on their way to school, and Mrs. Harbottle, with her basket clutched to her side like a shield, was already making her presence known outside the grocer's. Yet beneath that surface rhythm, Miss Marple sensed a tautness, an invisible thread drawn tight between certain people. Some, she noted, were avoiding each other with more care than usual. Others lingered too long in doorways, eyes sliding toward corners where they expected, or feared, someone might appear. After breakfast, she took a slow turn about the village, pausing here and there to exchange a word. At the post office, the postmistress mentioned in her quiet way that another foreign-stamped letter had gone out in the early hours, again to Lisbon, again without a return address. "Same hand as before," she murmured. Only this time the writer pressed harder, as if in a hurry or cross with themselves. Miss Marple accepted the information with a nod, filing it beside her growing collection of small but telling details. There was a pattern forming now. Lisbon was not an accident, and in her experience, repeated contact with a distant place often meant that whatever business was being conducted, there could not be allowed to surface here. From there she wandered toward the church, ostensibly to admire the late roses in the vicarage garden. Mrs. Parker was on the path, her arms full of hymnals, and she greeted Miss Marple with the mixture of relief and agitation of someone who has been keeping a story to herself and has just been handed the perfect excuse to tell it. "You haven't heard, I suppose," she began, lowering her voice though they were quite alone. "Mrs. Cutter was in the hall last night. After dark. I know because I'd left the vestry light on by mistake, and when I came back for it, the side door was just swinging shut. I called out, but she didn't answer, And when I checked the drawer where the fate accounts were kept, well, nothing was taken, but the papers were all shuffled about, and a few on top had smudges, like someone with polish on their fingers had been through them. Miss Marple expressed mild concern, then steered the conversation to more general matters, but inwardly, she felt the familiar click of two pieces sliding together. The polish on the fate photograph's backing, the repeated uninvited appearances, the rummaging that took nothing and yet disturbed everything. Mrs. Cutter was not looking for money. She was looking for something particular, and she knew where to search. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the decision had been made. It was time to see Inspector Hewitt again. She walked to the small station office in the next village, arriving just as he was returning from a call. He ushered her into his cramped but tidy office, where a kettle was always at the ready, and listened without interruption as she laid out the bare facts, the sightings of Mrs. Cutter, the shed, the Lane meeting, the Lisbon letters, and now the church hall intrusion. She did not, as was her habit, dress them in speculation, but presented them as the separate beads they were, leaving him to note the thread running through them. When she finished, Hewitt leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You're telling me you think all this ties back to Ralston?" "I am telling you," Miss Marple replied, "that people have been taking very careful steps to ensure we look at him, or someone like him, and not at whatever else they may be doing. It is my experience that when a man is said to be alive after years of being thought dead, there is often some other transaction being quietly accomplished under the cover of that talk." He regarded her with that mix of respect and frustration she had often inspired in policemen. "And you think the Lisbon connection is part of it?" "I think," she said gently, "that Lisbon is rarely without significance to those who have had dealings there before, and I believe Mr. Ralston had." Hewitt tapped a pencil against his blotter. "All right. I'll see if we can get a trace on any incoming or outgoing correspondence tied to that address, and I'll put a man to watch the Edge House grounds, quietly." Satisfied that she had planted the seeds she needed to, Miss Marple left him to his work. That evening, just before the lamps were lit, a knock sounded at her door. Clara Thorne stood there again, but this time her composure was thinner, the strain plain in her face. "I shouldn't be here," she said at once, "but I have to tell someone. Peter's been strange, preoccupied. He says it's about his patients, but I've seen him going through my uncle's old letters in the study late at night. And this morning, I found one in the wastepaper basket, torn in half, but I could still see the address." Lisbon Miss Marple invited her in, poured tea, and let her talk. Clara hesitated more than once, as if weighing how much to reveal, but the weight of keeping it to herself finally tipped the scales. She spoke of overhearing her husband on the telephone, his voice low and urgent, though she had caught no words, of finding mud on his shoes after a night when he'd claimed to be at the surgery, and of a remark he had made, almost to himself, about the whole thing unravelling if certain people couldn't keep quiet. When Clara fell silent, Miss Marple reached over and patted her hand. "My dear, the first thing is not to let on that you have noticed. Men who are entangled in matters they cannot speak of are like cats with string. They tangle themselves more efficiently when left to it. And the second thing is to be careful where you walk after dark." Clara managed a small smile at that, though it didn't reach her eyes. She left soon after, promising to try to be normal, though Miss Marple doubted there was much chance of that for either of the Thornes now. The rest of the evening passed in the slow, deliberate rhythm of her own company. She set her knitting aside to make notes on a small pad, just names, dates, and a few brief phrases that would be meaningless to anyone else. The pattern was sharpening. A woman who appeared and vanished with the stealth of a cat. A man who might or might not be the one buried years ago. Letters to a city where the past had left deep marks. And two households, Thornes and Carraways, where the air was charged with the tension of people holding too many half-truths. Before she banked the fire for the night, Miss Marple stood a moment at her front window, looking out over the quiet lane. The mist was rising again, softening the lamplight, blurring the hedges. Somewhere in that softened world, she thought, were the next steps in this business. Someone moving toward a meeting, or away from a place they should not have been, carrying with them the clue that would make sense of all the rest. And when they took that step, she intended to see it. Not with the urgency of the police, nor the indiscretion of village gossip, but with the calm certainty of one who knows that the truth, like a seed, will push its way to the surface in its own time, if only one is patient enough to watch. The following morning brought with it a thin, low cloud that hung over St. Mildred's like the lid of a pot, muting colour and sound. Miss Marple, standing at her kitchen window, thought it looked like the sort of day when people preferred to remain indoors, unless, of course, they had business they would rather no one saw. She buttered her toast slowly, her mind already turning over the threads she held. Mrs. Cutter's quiet rummaging, the Lisbon letters, the pale-coated figure, Clara Thorne's unease. It was less a matter now of finding loose ends than of noticing which hands were trying to tuck them out of sight. At mid-morning she decided on a trip to the vicarage under the pretext of bringing Mrs. Parker some cuttings from her geraniums. The vicar's wife was alone in the parlour, a basket of mending at her feet, and an air of having too much on her mind to give full attention to any of it. After the usual pleasantries, Mrs. Parker leaned forward, lowering her voice as if the curtains themselves might overhear. "You've seen Mrs. Carroway about, haven't you?" "Well, she was here 2 nights ago, after evensong. Said she wanted to talk to the vicar about some music for the children's choir, but when I went to fetch him from the study, she was standing at the window, looking out toward the churchyard. I thought she looked anxious, and when she left, I noticed one of the drawers in the sideboard had been left a little open. Nothing missing that I can see, but still." Miss Marple murmured her sympathy and let the conversation drift elsewhere, but the image stayed with her. Mrs. Carroway, poised in a stranger's parlour, her attention fixed on something beyond the glass. People do not peer at churchyards without reason, and reasons, in Miss Marple's experience, are rarely innocent when they come cloaked in other errands. From the vicarage she walked toward the high street. The post office door stood open, and the postmistress, seeing her pass, called her in. "Something odd this morning," she said quietly. A man came in to send a parcel, small, wrapped in brown paper, addressed to an accommodation address in London. Paid in cash, no return. Nothing in that by itself, but he was nervous. Kept glancing over his shoulder. And here's the thing. He had an accent. Couldn't place it exactly. Foreign, but not Mrs. Carroway's sort of foreign. Miss Marple asked lightly whether the man had been tall. The postmistress nodded. Tall, pale, with a coat that had seen better days. I'd not have thought much of it, but when he left, Mrs. Cutter came in not 2 minutes later, looking flustered and pretending she wanted stamps. She never buys stamps here, always at Much Whitlow when she goes on market day. That was worth noting. Miss Marple thanked her and continued on, stopping next at the grocer's. Here she found Mrs. Harbottle dispensing opinions with her usual generosity. "And I say, if a man's been dead all these years, he ought to stay that way. Popping up again only unsettles people." She broke off to give Miss Marple a pointed look. "They say he's been seen near the old path to the copse. Twice, after dark. Could be nonsense, of course, but..." She left the rest unsaid, the implication dangling like an unpicked apple. Miss Marple bought her tea and sugar, all the while thinking of the lane by the copse and the meeting she had witnessed there. If there had been another sighting, then the figure in the pale coat was moving with more boldness or more desperation. Either way, the odds of him remaining unseen much longer were narrowing. In the afternoon, she received a brief note slipped under her door. The handwriting was round, careful, and unmistakably Clara Thorne's. "Please come. Something's happened." She found Clara in the Edgehouse library, standing by the desk with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Peter's gone," she said without preamble. "He left just after lunch, said he was going into town, but he took an overnight bag. I only realized when I went upstairs for a book and saw the wardrobe door open. Some of his clothes are gone. And there was this. She held out a single sheet of paper, folded in half. It was a page torn from a prescription pad, on which was written in Peter Thorne's neat, controlled hand. "Don't worry. We'll explain soon. Please stay away from the shed." Miss Marple read it twice before setting it down. "Did you know he had been to the shed recently?" Clara shook her head. But I heard him out in the garden after midnight 2 nights ago. I thought he was just checking the gate." "The shed again. Always the shed." Miss Marple asked, as casually as she could, whether Clara would mind if she had a look. The younger woman hesitated, then nodded, fetching the key from a small hook behind the pantry door. They crossed the garden in silence, the long grass damp underfoot. The shed stood at the far edge, half in shadow from the overhanging trees. Clara unlocked it, the hinges creaking softly, and Miss Marple stepped inside. Dust motes swirled in the dim light from the single grimy window. Most of the space was as Mr. Pike had described: old crates, a broken chair, a few rusted tools. But in the corner nearest the window was a newer crate, its lid pried slightly open. Inside, neatly packed, were bundles of papers tied with string, a small tin box, and, tucked in one corner, a photograph in a cracked frame. She lifted the frame carefully. It was a portrait of Gilbert Ralston, younger, unsmiling, the same eyes as in the Fate photograph. On the back, in faded ink, was a date from 15 years ago and a note in a woman's hand. "For G, until we meet again." Miss Marple replaced it, closing the crate and stepping back into the garden. Clara was watching her, pale but composed. "Do you think Peter's mixed up in something to do with my uncle?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that there are people who would prefer certain matters from the past to remain undisturbed. And your husband may have found himself between their wishes and his own sense of what should be done." She left Clara with a few comforting words, but her mind was far from settled. The crate, the portrait, the note. It was not proof, but it was enough to suggest that the pale-coated man was not simply a decoy in someone else's game. Whether he was Ralston himself or an imposter, someone had gone to considerable trouble to keep his image, and perhaps his memory, preserved. That evening, as the light faded and the mist began to gather again over the fields, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, with her knitting untouched. She could feel the momentum building, the way one feels the river quicken before a fall. Somewhere, perhaps even tonight, another step would be taken. Someone would send a letter, keep a meeting, or make a move too hurried to be concealed. And when that happened, the pattern she had been patiently watching would come into sharp focus. For now, she waited, listening to the faint rustle of the wind through the hedges, knowing that in a village like St. Mildred's, silence is never truly empty. It is simply the space in which the truth gathers its breath. The next day began with a wind off the fields, sharp enough to send the few remaining leaves scurrying along the lanes. Miss Marple, wrapped in a shawl, stood at her garden gate for a moment before setting out. She had been thinking about Peter Thorne's disappearance all night, not in the feverish way of someone fearing the worst, but in the measured rhythm of someone turning a puzzle piece over until the shape of its edges becomes plain. His absence, the crate in the shed, the note telling Clara to stay away, none of it had the feel of a man running from danger. It felt rather like a man stepping into it on purpose. Her first stop was the post office. The postmistress looked up from weighing a parcel and, without prompting, said, "No Lisbon post today, but there was a telephone call for Mrs. Carroway just after 8. She came in to take it here, spoke in another language. Spanish, I think, or Portuguese. When she came out, she looked, well, not pleased, but decided. Like someone who's made up her mind to do something disagreeable." Miss Marple thanked her and lingered just long enough to see Mrs. Carroway herself pass by, dressed in a dark coat, her scarf pulled close, a long, narrow case in her hand. She walked quickly, not looking left or right, and took the turn toward the path that skirted the copse. By the time Miss Marple followed, at a distance so natural as to be unremarkable, the other woman had disappeared from sight. The path here dipped between hedges before opening toward the fields. 100 yards further on, a figure emerged from the opposite direction. Tall, pale coat, the stride purposeful even on the uneven ground. The two met near the old oak, speaking briefly. Miss Marple could not catch the words, but she saw the case pass from Mrs. Carroway's hand to his. He opened it, glanced inside, and shut it again with a small, decisive nod. Then they parted without further ceremony, he toward the lane. She backed toward the village. Miss Marple waited until both had gone before crossing to where they had stood. There was nothing left but a faint impression in the grass, the kind that would vanish with the next wind. But impressions, she knew, were not always in the ground. They were often in the mind, waiting for the right memory to match them. She turned back toward the village, detouring to the Greyhound. Inside, Mr. Trellis was polishing glasses, his eyes bright with the sort of news he liked best, half fact, half guesswork. "You'll have heard there's talk of trouble at Edgehouse," he began, before she could order her tea. "Word is, Dr. Thorne's not gone to any town but to the coast. A friend of mine swears he saw him boarding the early train at Crampton, carrying a case, and not alone. Says there was a gentleman with him, foreign-looking, dark hair, sharp suit. They kept to themselves, but you could see they knew each other." Miss Marple accepted her tea without outward reaction, but inwardly the picture shifted. Peter Thorne, travelling in company, not in solitude, meant his departure was not an escape, but an engagement, and if he had gone to the coast, there was the possibility of a crossing. Lisbon was, after all, a port's promise away. In the afternoon, she walked to Edgehouse, under the pretext of bringing Clara some cuttings. Clara opened the door herself, her face drawn but her manner composed in that brittle way that speaks of effort rather than ease. "No word from Peter," she said quietly, leading Miss Marple into the parlour. "I rang the surgery. No calls left there. I've told the police, but they say there's no evidence of harm. I keep thinking, what if it's to do with my uncle? What if he's gone to find him?" Miss Marple set the cuttings on the table and regarded her gently. "And if he has?" Clara hesitated, then said, "Then perhaps he's gone to finish something that should have been finished years ago." She looked toward the library door, as though she might see him standing there. "I've been thinking about what you said, about people preferring the past to stay buried. I think Peter may have decided it shouldn't be." When Miss Marple left Edgehouse, the wind had dropped and the air had grown still again, the kind of stillness that precedes either rain or revelation. She took the long way home, past Miller's cottage. Mrs. Carroway was outside, speaking to a boy who had brought her the evening paper. She paid him, glanced toward Miss Marple with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and went inside, closing the door firmly behind her. Miss Marple paused just long enough to glance at the paper the boy carried, a London edition, earlier than the local deliveries. It was unusual, in her experience, for Mrs. Carroway to have her news from anywhere but the village. That night, Miss Marple kept her lamp low and her ears open. Around 10:30, the sound came. A motorcar moving slowly along the lane, stopping near enough that the crunch of tyres on gravel was distinct. She waited at the window until she saw a figure step out, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat pulled low. He crossed toward the side of the church, pausing once to look behind him, then disappeared into the shadows. 10 minutes later, he returned, something small in his hand, and drove off without lights until he was well past the last house. She noted the time, the shape of the man's walk, and the way he kept the object close, as if it were not his to display. In her experience, people who take such care to hide what they carry do so not because it is fragile, but because it is dangerous. The next morning, Inspector Hewitt called at her cottage, his manner brisk but with an edge of unease. "We've had a report," he said as soon as they were seated. "A man's body was found early today, down near the estuary. No identification, but tall, well-dressed foreign features. And in his pocket, a ticket for yesterday's early train from Crampton. Miss Marple listened without outward surprise, though inwardly she felt the slow, inevitable shift of the pieces into place. And Dr. Thorne? No sign of him, Hewitt said, nor of anyone matching Ralston's description. But there was something else. The dead man was carrying a small case, empty. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while in the quiet, her hands folded. The case, she suspected, was the same one she had seen pass between Mrs. Carroway and the man in the pale coat. Empty now, but not empty then. Whatever it had held had moved from hand to hand, and now, perhaps, into some place where neither the police nor the village could easily find it. The truth, she thought, was close enough that she could almost feel the last of the mist lifting from it. And when it cleared, she suspected it would reveal not just who had been alive and who had been dead, but who had chosen to alter the difference for their own ends. Inspector Hewitt returned that afternoon with fewer certainties than a policeman likes and more facts than a village can digest. The dead man at the estuary had been identified by the station at Crampton from a consular card and a slip of paper sewn into his lining. Manuel Alves, a shipping clerk who had entered the country 3 days before. He had, in his pocket, the return half of a ferry ticket and a schedule with 2 places ringed, Crampton and St. Mildred's. There were no bruises on his knuckles, no blood under his nails. Whatever had happened to him had been quick and efficient, and the estuary had done what estuaries do, bore him away from the place where it was done. As for the small case he'd carried, the lining still held the imprint of something flat and rectangular. The case itself was empty. Miss Marple listened, asked nothing unnecessarily, and when Hewitt finished, she only said, "If a thing goes from hand to hand and leaves one of them dead, Inspector, someone is very anxious that the thing should go no further. And yet it has." "What thing?" he asked, patient and stubborn at once. "The sort of thing," she said, "that makes people ransack vestry drawers, sew mourning bands onto hats, and take letters to Lisbon. Not money. You do not hide money in a church hall. A paper, perhaps. Or a picture. Something that can tell on a man without help." He held her gaze for a moment, then conceded, "Very well. Something like that. If the courier brought it, who has it now?" "Who needed him alive until the handover," said Miss Marple, "and dead after? Or who feared he would talk, and so preferred him not to?" She hesitated, then added what she knew would sound like fancy to him. "I think the thing he brought is something that says Mr. Ralston was alive when he ought to have been dead, or dead when he ought to have been alive. Either way, it would put several people in an awkward position." When he had gone, she sat with her knitting untouched, thinking of the shed and of the tin box in the crate she had not opened. It had been a long time since she had wanted strongly to open a box. One learns over the years that other people's boxes make one a conspirator when one intended to be only a witness. But it seemed to her now that someone else would open that box soon, and not for the same reasons she would. She put on her coat and went to Edgehouse, with the sort of errand any kind old woman might have at tea time. 2 fruit scones in a paper bag, and a question about cuttings. Clara looked tired and was grateful for the scones. She took Miss Marple straight through to the kitchen, as if she did not want her guest to see the library again. When Miss Marple asked, quite as one asks about nothing, whether the key to the shed had been put back, Clara reached for it at once, then paused. The hook behind the pantry door was empty. "It was there this morning," she said, and in her voice there was that particular note people get when they realize their own house has kept a secret from them. "Peter kept it there. Perhaps I forgot. Perhaps I gave it to Mr. Pike." Miss Marple did not correct her. "Perhaps," she said. "It is very easy to lay things down in the wrong place when one is thinking of other matters. Might we walk down a little and settle our minds?" In the late light, the grass looked colder. The shed door was not merely unlocked, it was pulled to without the catch, in the careless way of people who think no one will come behind them. Inside, the crate had been moved again. There were marks on the floor where it had been dragged. The portrait of Gilbert Ralston lay with its glass face down, unbroken, as though the person who had put it aside did not dislike him enough to smash him. The tin box had gone. Clara stood so still that for a moment Miss Marple thought the girl had not seen it. Then she did the most sensible thing frightened woman can do. She did not cry out. She lifted the lid, looked at the empty corner, and shut it again, as if to say there was no use in staring at a vacancy. "I didn't know Peter had a key to this," she said quietly, telling herself an explanation because it is a kind of shelter. Perhaps he gave it to Mr. Pike. Perhaps, said Miss Marple. Someone else made a key. She touched the hasp with a gentle forefinger. Older locks are very obliging. They take any suitor who presses them politely. When they reached the house again, Miss Marple asked to wash her hands, which took her past the library and into the small cloakroom, where a person's hat and gloves sometimes tell more than their mouth does. On the little table lay a pair of brown leather gloves, too large for Clara and too neat for Mr. Pike. The left glove's forefinger had a faint crescent of polish caught in the seam. Someone had wiped a hand in haste and then pulled the glove on. Miss Marple did not touch them. She came back to the kitchen and told Clara, in her gentle, firm voice, that she ought not to be alone tonight. "You know how people are," she added kindly. "They bring soup, and you find you cannot swallow it. Come and sit with me an hour after supper. Mrs. Weatherby will join us, and you will think of other things." Clara agreed, because she wanted very much to be told what to do by someone who sounded as if she had always known. When she had gone, Miss Marple walked on to the vicarage with her scones bag now empty and asked for 2 small favours, which Mrs. Parker granted without seeing them as favours. The first was that the little notice board outside the church should carry, by evensong tomorrow, a note that the village history exhibition would be briefly rehung on Saturday, owing to the recovery of certain additional items. The second was that Mrs. Parker would say, cheerfully and quite aloud in the grocer's that afternoon, that the negative of the fate photograph had come to light after all. "In a drawer I had quite forgotten, dear me." And that the vicar hoped to make fresh prints, which always pleases people who like to have things. "What if it causes trouble?" Mrs. Parker asked, trembling between duty and disturbance. "My dear," said Miss Marple, "it will cause behaviour. I am always very fond of behaviour. It tells one so much." By tea time, the behaviour had begun. Mrs. Harbottle hoped aloud that the nasty picture would be buried again at once, and then hurried to tell Mr. Trellis at the Greyhound the news before he could tell her. Colonel Faraday said it was the modern nonsense of photographs that caused all the fuss in the first place, and asked whether he could have 2 copies. The postmistress, who never shows surprise, did not show it now, but made a little pile of brown envelopes on her counter as if for orders, which meant that by 6:30 the village had come in, to ask about prints. Mrs. Cutter came in 3 times, first for stamps, then for string, and at last to ask whether the notice meant that certain mistakes would be corrected. She had a bright, tight look about the mouth that always means someone has said "at last" to themselves in a mirror. When she left, she went not toward Much Whitlow, but down the lane by Miller's cottage. Mrs. Carroway, at that moment at her piano with a little boy bravely falling off his scales, stopped in the middle of a bar and said they would try again from the beginning. The boy said later to his mother that Mrs. Carroway's hands had shaken. Miss Marple had in the meantime composed another notice, which she put, with the vicar's permission, on the inner door of the church hall, where people must brush past it to enter. Any person who believes they have a rightful claim to be omitted from any image on display is requested to speak to the vicar before Saturday noon. The negative appears to show certain details more plainly than before. Details, Miss Marple had found, are like bees. People who are afraid of them cannot help flinching. At 9 that night, when Clara had been settled with Mrs. Weatherby and a harmless radio programme, Miss Marple walked, with a shawl and her knitting, as far as the lich gate. She did not stand in the hall. She sat on the little bench just inside the churchyard, the place where old people rest without being noticed. From there one can see the vestry door and, in the glimmer of the lamp beyond the yew, the faint shine of the hall's small latch. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The village, tired of its own talk, had gone to bed. The first to come was Mrs. Cutter, in a coat too fine for a servant and too old for a lady. She moved briskly, like a woman who has rehearsed being brave. She went to the hall door, tried it, found it latched, and produced, ah yes, a key that obligingly turned. She slipped in. 5 minutes later there was another shadow, this one smaller and quicker, pausing once as if to listen. Mrs. Carroway's headscarf was darker tonight. The band of crape lay low across her brow. She did not go to the hall. She went to the vestry, where the drawer had once held what she wanted, and where, if she were lucky, it might hold it again. The two doors closed softly behind them, like lids. Miss Marple rose at once and walked the 20 yards to the vicarage gate, where Inspector Hewitt, summoned by a note she had sent with Mrs. Weatherby's nephew, waited in the dark with the resigned air of a man who has agreed to humour an old lady and finds he cannot quite resent it. 2, she whispered, vestry and hall. He did not waste time asking how she knew. He went to the vestry, his constable to the hall. There were the small sounds of people who have been surprised in the wrong room. Then, in the passage between, the two women, converging, met as the vicar's lamp came up, and Hewitt's voice said, very level, that they would please come along. "You cannot keep it," Mrs. Cutter burst out before anyone had spoken of keeping anything. "If the negative shows him, if it shows his face, then it must be burned." "It does not show what you think," Mrs. Carroway said sharply, her accent rising like a ripple where she tried to press it flat. "It shows the ring on a hand. And you wore gloves that day." "I wore gloves," Mrs. Cutter returned, "because a woman who has been turned out in a week without wages does not come to a fate with bare hands. I am not ashamed." She lifted her chin. "You stood with him as a wife stands. You sent him away and thought the village too stupid to know." "That is enough," said Hewitt, but it was not, because the words once started would not stop. They never do when the thing people have kept in their mouths has cut them too long. "You will not mention my husband," Mrs. Carroway said, the last word edged like glass. "He was dead when I came here. He was dead because a man in this village wrote to Lisbon with papers that said another man was dead when he was not, so that money would go where it should not." Miss Marple stepped into the light then, very quiet, as if she had strayed there by accident. "My dear," she said, "you have been very brave, but it is time to be careful. Saying everything at once is like taking all the chairs from under people at supper. Let us put one or two back." They looked at her as people look at a person who has reminded them of parlour manners at the gallows. Hewitt nodded for her to go on. So she did, but not with accusations. She spoke as if she were knitting. A loop of a summer 15 years ago. A man of business who went abroad and was reported dead when perhaps he was not. A housekeeper dismissed and a foreign wife kept quiet with promises. A doctor by marriage who found in his wife's uncle's papers a proof that would turn out legacies and reputations. A courier who brought something too hot to carry far. A tin box moved from a shed. Hands polished and unpolished that could not help leaving their mark. "And the negative?" Hewitt asked, because policemen must ask the question in a room full of other questions. "The negative," said Miss Marple, "was never lost. It was returned to the photographer's shop with the other rubbish and taken out again by someone who knew exactly what it showed." She looked at Mrs. Carroway's hand, where the narrow ring with the tiny buckle lay against the knuckle like a secret that had grown tired of secrecy. It showed that the woman beside Mr. Ralston was not the niece he left his estate to. It showed a ring he had given in a country where marriages can be made quietly, and a hand that was too familiar with his sleeve for the village fiction. She turned to Mrs. Cutter with a kindness that was not indulgence. And you knew it, you saw it and held it, and thought at last you could recover the wages of being treated as furniture. But you mistook which wrong would right which other. Mrs. Cutter's shoulders sagged. I wanted him made to pay. I wanted her made to pay. All of them. She jerked her head toward the house on the hill. She got everything. She got a house with empty rooms, Miss Marple said, and a husband who has gone to make something right at last. Hewitt looked up. Gone to where? To meet Mr. Ralston, Miss Marple said, and this time it was not speculation, but the quiet acceptance of a sum done to the end. He left with the courier from Crampton, because a man like that does not hand a paper to a stranger and leave his wife here to pay for it. He meant to bring Mr. Ralston to a place where a man must either stand up or sit down at last. And the dead man? Hewitt asked. Dead because he stood too near the door when someone in a pale coat wanted what he carried, Miss Marple said softly. But the case was empty when he was found, which means the paper, whatever it is here, in the village. And because it has not yet been waved, it is in the hands of someone who thinks waving is vulgar. She glanced once, gently, toward the dark beyond the yew, where the path to Edgehouse gleamed a little in the damp. Doctors are tidy. They put things where they can find them, and they go back for them when no one is looking. I think, if you walk very quietly, Inspector, you will find that a certain desk contains a new thing among its old things. And if it does, he said, halfway to the door. Then we will invite Mr. Ralston to tea, Miss Marple said, as if that were the most ordinary conclusion in the world. And in the course of the afternoon, we will discover whether he is still alive or merely has been kept so on paper. When Hewitt and his constable moved off through the passage, Mrs. Carroway and Mrs. Cutter stood in the yellow circle of lamplight like two women who had met at a mirror and disliked both reflections. Miss Marple took each by an elbow, in the way of an old lady who is not strong but is persuasive, and led them toward the hall door. There is still time, she said, in that calm voice which had soothed infants and disarmed bullies, for people to save what can be saved and confess what cannot. You will both be asked to say how you came by your knowledge. It will go better for you if you do not embroider. Embroidery made this trouble. Plain sewing will help mend it. Outside, the wind had dropped. The notice on the board stirred once and lay still. In the vicarage window, a light moved from one room to another. Miss Marple, who had always liked houses when the lights moved sensibly, thought that by tomorrow the village would have something else to talk about than the photograph. It would have a man and a paper and a truth that made sense of both. And if, in the telling, there were hearts hurt and prides wounded, she would put the kettle on and find cups and say, as she always did, that human nature was very much the same in St. Mildred's as it was in Lisbon, and that the only thing to do with it was to see it plainly. The following afternoon brought with it the kind of pale, cool sunshine that turns the village green into a place where people pause, though no one quite knows why. Miss Marple sat in her little parlour with the curtains drawn back, the teapot at her elbow, and an extra cup set out. She had asked Inspector Hewitt to arrange for Dr. Thorne to call, and if possible, to bring his guest. She made no mention of names. Good policemen prefer to discover things in their own way. The knock came just after 3. Hewitt entered first, his expression one of contained satisfaction, followed by Dr. Thorne, who looked tired but not defeated, and behind him, Gilbert Ralston. The years had thinned his hair and deepened the lines about his eyes, but there was no mistaking him. He took the offered chair with the wariness of a man who has been made to sit in rooms where the questions are not friendly. "I suppose you want an explanation," he said at last. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Explanations, in my experience, come more readily when one is not pressed for them. But I should like to understand why a man long thought dead has chosen to be alive again, and why so many people have worked to keep both those conditions secret." Ralston's gaze shifted to Dr. Thorne. It was the doctor who answered. "My uncle by marriage disappeared for reasons connected to business abroad, reasons that might have meant prison if certain papers had come to light. There was a legal arrangement made involving the transfer of property to Clara. He stayed in Lisbon, and for years it suited everyone to leave it at that. But recently, one of those papers, proof that the report of his death had been false, resurfaced. A courier was sent to bring it here. That was the man you found at the estuary, Hewitt interjected. And someone killed him for it. Yes, Thorne said. The paper could have overturned the estate settlement, embarrassed half the people who dealt with him, and implicated others. I meant to hand it over to the authorities, but it was stolen from me before I could. Miss Marple poured the tea, her voice mild. By someone who thought it safer to bargain with it than to destroy it. Mrs. Carroway, perhaps, or Mrs. Cutter. Both had reasons to prefer the past altered. Ralston looked up sharply. Mrs. Carroway had nothing to do with... She had everything to do with keeping your secret, Miss Marple said quietly. That ring in the fate photograph was not Clara's. You married her abroad, didn't you? Quietly. And when you disappeared, you left her without recognition or protection. She came here under another name and kept her silence until the photograph threatened to make her visible. Mrs. Carroway herself stood in the doorway. Then, having been summoned by Hewitt, she met Miss Marple's eyes without flinching. I wanted only to keep what little I had, she said simply. That paper could have exposed me too. And Mrs. Cutter? Hewitt asked. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once before she set them down. She wanted justice, as she saw it, for being turned out without wages, for seeing others rewarded while she was left with nothing. She took the paper from the shed, thinking it would give her power. Instead, it made her a target for whoever killed the courier. Hewitt nodded slowly. It was found in your desk, Doctor. Exactly where Miss Marple said it would be. Thorne didn't deny it. I recovered it from Mrs. Cutter, but by then it had already set too many things in motion. I thought if I could bring Ralston back and let him explain himself, we might avoid a scandal. Ralston's expression was one of weary resignation. The scandal is unavoidable, but perhaps survivable. Miss Marple poured the last cup of tea. That depends on how much truth you are willing to tell, Mr. Ralston. Human nature has a way of filling in the gaps, and it rarely fills them kindly. In the end, the matter resolved as such things often do, with statements taken, reputations bruised but not destroyed, and certain facts quietly filed away where they would do the least harm. Mrs. Carroway left the village within the week, her piano sold to a family in Much Whitlow. Mrs. Cutter remained, her tongue as sharp as ever, but she no longer lingered near the church hall. Dr. Thorne and Clara kept to themselves for a time. The shadows in their marriage neither deepened nor entirely dispelled. As for Gilbert Ralston, he was seen only once more, walking alone down the lane toward the copse, hat in hand, as if taking leave of a place that had never quite decided whether it wanted him dead or alive. When Miss Marple spoke of it afterward, she did so with her usual quiet detachment. It is not the photographs, you know, she told Mrs. Weatherby over tea. It is the people in them. A picture only shows what is there to be seen. But if you wish to know the truth, you must look at what they are trying to hide. And with that, she picked up her knitting again. The matter closed, as far as the village was concerned.